just done so long, crying, Lord, Lord, give we more time for crying. I've been in vicious storm so long. Oh, this your honey. Oh, this your honey time. Crying, Lord, Lord, give we more time for prize. I've been in vicious storm so long. Don't let me different. Yeah, like a dish. Talk. I can see long way cross and thing like that. Even back to the motherland. Maybe Tifi people from. Maybe Igbo, Nadinka, Malenke, Yoruba, Gullah, Geechee, Many, Kenny, Feet, maybe then Geechee, and maybe Chima, Gullah, Yamasi, Kosal, and these two, Gullah, the Koyin, and we don't have one family. Like a ship, 100 children a day, and it's just suckle now. We had this shit thing, we still living. Got a family compound. 100 yeah, they call it sea islands. Let's see, 100 Koyin. Yeah, you cannot see like this shit we call. But you got these young mountain thing, but they all round. Rocky in a little bit. Can't see in the distance. And we're gonna look back yonder. They are course. So when we come up here, this your mountain. I have to bring things like this. Because they have this your water. We don't stand it. 100 people crack their teeth and call this your thing. Adaptation. Let's see. When I use such a word in my language and things like that, what a Gullah in the Gullah Geechee nation. But I have no word for this shit thing. We just live it. And we crack the teeth and plenty of things. We just live this shit. But see, just like have a comfortable place, they call it low country. Now we're high and thing like that. We take some adapting. So, if maybe going back down, men I need this year, dog. We ain't half I had this year. Women are different. You could come in, and this your time, yeah. We don't walk around like this year. I'd rather was, ain't first need no sleep, thank you, man. Ain't first need no sleep, dog. But when I see it, I'm just to be inside this your time, he have joy, because he did, he had to walk. Just like we ancestors did it back yonder. But the harvest ended it like it been back yonder. Because the thing will be dropping out the sky back then. They drop out so much snow. Not this little thing y'all have on here called snow. The thing was all of me rise sometimes. Rain. And we just see that's that. And we just study about that thing. Because you know, when you not got no rain, you not got no fresh water. Man, I got them fresh water. You get these other rest of things growing even in the hosta. Or I ain't want taking this tall. And rather was thing one used to grow like a this year. You ain't grow like this year high. Because they need all this year water. Some of we ain't have enough water. But we don't grow this year high and grow like a this year. But we can't understand how you do like a this year. And everything else. Heating water. Red water. But we ain't study about that. We're not adapt to what's going on now. So many a time when we are coming from where they from and things like that, I have a going in and rather what's coming is your mountain thing. You have to adapt in the way we the crack we teach too. So plenty of times we have to adapt to speaking like this when we get elsewhere. Otherwise we get looks like what many of you have given me already. Because if we don't understand, we can't communicate, we can't connect many times. But in the Gullah Geechee Nation, one of the first ways that we connect is by you being able to enter our circle, which, as I said to you in my native language, Gullah, that we still live in. We call them the family compound. So today, we needed you to join in to this family compound so that we can truly have what to me community means. Common unity unifies you, what you have in common. And water, I think, is something we all have in common. Is it not? Because our bodies are made of mostly what? Water. Water. But yet, many of us are not drinking enough water. You don't want to answer now. You're drinking enough, but not the other stuff. What should we be drinking all the time? Water. Because without water, we don't function the right way. Everything within us starts to alter and adapt itself to something else, but not in a good, not in a healthy way. No, you don't get to sit outdoors. You must be in the sun. And so, more often than not, what tends to happen is that we don't even think about not having drank enough water until someone says, we got to go to the hospital. Because we're now what? Dehydrated. The same way as I said to you in Gullah, we weren't thinking a lot about water because we live on the sea islands. From Jacksonville, North Carolina to Jacksonville, Florida. So when our plants that used to grow to my height were only starting to grow to waistline height, then we started thinking there's not enough rain. And if there's not enough rain, not only do we have a problem with the plants that grow, but even then we have problems with the bacteria that does grow in the shellfish. These are things that we now have to adapt to understand. Just like there's no word adaptation in the Gullah language, as I said earlier. There's no word called Vibrio in it either. But I had to learn that one from biologists that study our oysters and our oyster beds, which after a little while you're going to get to see just a little bit of the land that I represent as Queen Quet, Chiefess and Head of State for the Gullah Geechee Nation. But just as I mentioned, this is a journey for me, coming from an area that is the Gullah Geechee Nation that encompasses all the sea islands in the area called the Low Country. Because we have flat land where we can see in the distance, and as I said to you here, you can't do that because you got mountains blocking you all around while you're in the valley. But there are many people who lived on our shorelines that had to adapt, that had to adjust, that had to move, that had to migrate. Like many of you that are probably here and probably not natives of Colorado, even if you live here now. But people begin to move. But when they move, it's very rare that they leave other things behind. They always take things with them. They take the things they treasure with them. And one of the things that I think we all tend to treasure is who makes us who we are. So we take with us our culture and our traditions, our languages, our ways, and all of these things. And we often don't think about the fact that someone else has a different language, they have a different way, until we get to where they are. And we say, well, where I live, we always drink coffee and stuff, so where's Starbucks? And then people go, Starbucks? There's no buck around here except the daily thing that we hunt. We don't have no bucks, so what's Starbucks? Oh, that's a coffee place. So make your own coffee at home. And then you say, I don't believe these people. How dare they not have these conversations? And then you want to build a Starbucks in the middle of a rural community. That's an island where people fish and hunt for their livelihood, where coffee is not an appetizer for us. Actually, we may start the day drinking water that we pump from a hand pump. And so people will come in and either have to adjust to the way we are, or they migrate somewhere else where they can get closer to the Starbucks. But then there are those who say, no, I don't want to leave. I love the place. It's beautiful. I want to stay here with you. You want to stay? Well, then you need to learn how we've managed to live in that same place since the 1600s and can still have as close to pristine waterways as you can imagine, where we can still get shrimp and oysters and various kinds of fish each day that we can go out with a cast net and bring back in spite of the fact that we're in a hurricane zone. In spite of the fact that people who wanted Starbucks built places like Hilton Head, because you will find one or two over there. Okay? Because they wanted to adapt to the world they lived in before, even though they said the world we live in is the one they want to live in now. So now that they brought in what wasn't there, that doesn't fit very well on this land and along the water and into the marsh, now they're realizing, whoa, wait a minute, because we built all of this stuff right into the marsh, whenever the tide comes and goes, much less a hurricane comes, the sand rushes out faster. Oh, what's going on? Hi, we told y'all at the zoning meetings that would happen. And the response was, y'all are just emotional. Literal quote. These natives are just emotional, was what we're told. Really? I'm a computer scientist and mathematician. I think I'm a bit more than emotional. I think I'm a bit logical too. That you cannot put that massive amount of pressure from all these buildings on what are barrier sea islands and expect not to create damage to the environment. And even those buildings you build, they will sink. They will fall. The tide is not going to be held up because you think you want to go 4! While we yelled at 5! Oh, God's over there. Every 2 minutes, somebody's screaming 4, which is crazy. It's such a peaceful place. The sound travels to, you see. So when we first started hearing 4, we're like, what's all the yelling? What is that? What are these white things flying through the air? For what reason? You can't eat those. They're making all of this space for all of this just to walk around and now have hovercraft over. But what about the food? What about the agriculture? What about the things that actually feed us, including the water? When we were building, were you thinking about the water? No. And so more often than not, people will come into communities and not communicate with those communities because community doesn't mean to them what it meant to me, that it unifies you what you have in common. And in fact, look and say, well, wow, you look different than me, so no, you can't have anything in common. Which may not be true if you took the time to speak. You see. And more often than not, that's what's missing now. Because there is no circle. There is no automatic link and connection that causes us all to expand our circles that are beyond the ones we have on Google and Google Plus. We're about to expand. No. They're going to do it. They're going to move back and y'all are going to come in. All right? That's how we do that. There's 2 more here. Right there. Come on. Now you see how quickly people want to adapt to being on the outside of the circle instead of being into it? And why is that? One gentleman walked in and right away said, are you kidding? There's no line or chairs? And we said, no. He said, actually for a community engagement, you gotta be kidding. I said, right. How dare us make a circle? All right? How dare us make a place and a space that all of us can come together. All of us can see in the same level of distance. We can actually look into the souls of one another. They used to say that the eyes are the window to what? The soul, right? But if I'm sitting behind your head at everything, a little hard to get to your eyeballs, right? You know, let's have that x-ray vision, right? So this is something that is so critical when we start to talk about communities and community adaptation. We have to realize that all of us come from different communities, but the one community we all have in common is what? The world. The world. Exactly. The one we're living on. That ought to unify us because we have the whole world in common. And what's traveling through between all of what we call the continents is again what? Water. And water has no boundaries. Water will find its own level. So as we move about, we need to be in a flow. And that's what this whole session is going to connect you to. How do you flow into a community as opposed to come in and tell them what they need around here, right? But actually how do you come in, and then sometimes water needs to rest. You see? There are certain bodies of water that sit, and they're really still. And then there are those hurricane waters that come in and pull stuff out, and sometimes you got to do that, too. Because you may get in a community where these folks don't want to say nothing to you. But you need to hear from them. Because you can't know what we all could do and what we could learn from them if they too have lived where they are for 400 years like my people have. Because they might be the ones that have just what you need. It may not be. Where are all my scientists in there? Raise your hand. Raise your hand. No offense, don't be scared. I'm scientist. It may not be them that you need. Because they don't have the data that they have. Because they live directly on the ground. They're not going in by Google Earth and saying, this is how this spot looks. And then let's see what computer science program. Let's get Queen Quit. She says she's a computer scientist. Let's devise a program and let's enter this data about the population statistics and what the mean average is of the income there. And let's also measure the drought fall NOAA. Any NOAA people here today? That we can check NOAA. See, I thought so. I thought you saw me look that way, right? I felt it. I looked it up, I saw it. And so now we get to NOAA and we say, I need some data from you. And what can you send over? And she sends those data layers and we enter it and then we come and we tell them, okay, this is what y'all going to stop doing. And this is what you need to stop doing. And then if you don't stop doing it, we're going to get the EPA and we're going to get them to set laws. And then they're going to make you stop doing it. You have to stop doing this. That's what the community ends up hearing. Everything they need to stop instead of what they should continue. And many times you'll find that traditional communities, indigenous communities, communities that are rural communities, have lived from the water and the land quite in balance before the folks who wanted to recreate their came. The folks who saw it as a commercial opportunity came. Those who said, well, I'm a tourist and I'm bringing 100 more of my friends back, so y'all need to build hotels here, came. And then they didn't think about where they were building. Because they didn't talk to them. Because they said, well, y'all need to stop coming to the meetings because you're just emotional. Why can't we build a 200-story hotel here in the marsh? What's the matter? You have the statistics that prove this amount of people will come if we build it. Didn't you watch the movie? Build it and they will come. But when they come, what damage do they leave in their wake? Do they toss styrofoam cups out the window after drinking Starbucks? Or did they say, well, I don't do that because I bring my recyclable cup with me everywhere I go. I keep my cup. It's not me that did that. Okay? But were you the one that drove your car on the beach because you thought it'd be fun? Oh. So here are all these different things that people do that sometimes they do it just because they don't know any better. And so one of the Gullah Geechee proverbs we grew up with is, I don't know why I do that. So today, we as members of different communities want to share the things that we've seen that are what y'all might call in your world best practices. Good things that you can do to work with communities. But of course, there's a best, there's a worst. So you might just hear a few examples that might sound familiar, and you might go, oh my God, she's talking about me again. But don't feel hurt. We're not going to beat you up or anything. We're just going to give you things to make you think. What can we all do better? So if the worst practice comes up in anything we mention that sounds like something you engage in now, we hope you will adapt and don't engage in it after this session anymore. And go back to your communities and open a circle of discussion even further so that they too will want to change. So that we all can share in this world for a lot more generations in a much better way than we're doing right now. And so it was interesting to me as I flew here from the Gullah Geechee Nation, I'm an avid reader, was that I call myself pulling something to bring with me to relax with, my yoga journal, right? I figured I'd get there, meditation, stretch while getting on and off of planes, all that good stuff. Didn't expect to open up to an article that is actually entitled Standing up for the planet together. I believe in divine order. I don't believe in coincidence. So when I saw that, I just looked up like that. And the planet said, okay, I get it. I'm going to the right place at the right time. I then went, what issue is this? Because I tend to leave magazines on the shelf for a while before I get the chance to read them because of my schedule. And I said, oh, May 2013. So, yes, this is a message for me. All right, come on. Come join the circle way up front. We have more members coming. We know it. Now, so I loved reading this article, and some of you probably will too. But I wanted to read something from it that I thought was so critical to what we're here to discuss. It says, what might be the state of things 40 years from now if we don't get our act together? The changes we've seen came from raising the Earth's temperature at a single degree. But the same scientists who told us this would happen and who predicted its effects tell us that 1 degree could turn into 3 or 4 degrees in the middle of the century. If that happens, the thing we call civilization will simply become a sputtering mechanism for responding to emergencies. The world's agronomists, for instance, tell us that for each temperature increase in global temperature, we can expect a 10% decline in grain yields. Imagine our planet producing 40% fewer calories. I know, ladies, we like to produce 40% fewer calories. But imagine the planet doing that. Forget development and peace and all the other things we devoutly hope and work for. It will just be a chain of chaos. You can react to that news in 2 ways, each in some sense appropriate. One is despair, curling in on yourself. I've had a bit of that myself, it says. Back in 1989, as a 28-year-old, he said that he wrote a book for the general audience about global warming, and it scared him silly. All right? But now, he jumps to saying over the past 2 decades, we've employed many mitigating tactics, all of them valuable, but none of them sufficient. He says people have made changes in their lifestyles, from switching light bulbs to renouncing meat. All of it helps a little. But it has become clear that the math of climate change won't yield in the time we have to an individual action alone. We need to change not just our lives, but structures. It's not about installing a new energy-saving bulb, but about installing a new economic paradigm that will turn us away from the brink, which means politics, but not necessarily partisan politics. In fact, electing politicians has so far produced precious little change because the power of the fossil fuel industry is so incredibly strong. The oil industry alone spends an average of $400,000 a day lobbying the U.S. Congress. So we have to find some currency other than money with which to take them on. You don't have any idea what currency he proposes?
People power. People.
The people power. The power of the people. We can put it in any order, right? And he says passion, spirit, creativity, love. Passion, spirit, creativity, love. Words that I have had people use as adjectives to describe me after presentations. So I like that article a lot. Like, hey, sounds like you wrote it for me, you know. But definitely something to inspire, something that we hope we can use in this session to engage. And this session is 2 parts. So this morning, we're going to share with you from those best practices, those worst practices, and giving you some information on what our organizations each do every day to be part of this global change of structure and of ways in which we can look to the future and adapt appropriately. But in the second part, we're actually going to do a training, which is going to be interactive. That's why I'm trying to engage some of you right now. You see what I'm saying? We want to make sure you're awake, and we know after lunch you might just go to sleep. So we'd like to see the same faces back. Bring friends with you, but don't skip out on us, because it won't be any of this happening in the afternoon. So we know that it's kind of hard to decide with all these simultaneous events going on, where to go next and all of that. But we hope that you will be around so that when we actually get into the training and the actual physical use of the toolkit, we have as many hands to work on it together as we possibly can. And so when they told the four of us that we want you all to know you've all been selected to present at the inaugural National Adaptation Forum, we all said, yes! And then the next emails came and said, and now we know you don't know each other, but could you work together? Ooh, wow. Huh, never heard of them. Hey, where are they from? What are they going to present on? There's a thing called teleconference. Let's email, let's see if we can do a teleconference. So we had to adapt in order to even do this session. Because we each thought we had an hour and a half. And then we had to wind that down and say, no, we got an hour and a half to share. And then we asked for 3 hours, so we ended up with that. And so some of the ladies that are here today, I'm going to introduce them each separately, because I want you to be able to retain who we each are. Who am I? Queen. Now you got the queen part. Queen Quet. And you have a cheat sheet up there behind me, actually. I'm Queen Quet, and I'm the chiefess and head of state for the Gullah Geechee Nation. My home island is St. Helena Island, South Carolina, which is midway through between Jacksonville, North Carolina, and Jacksonville, Florida. The Gullah Geechee Nation encompasses all the sea islands and 30 to 35 miles inland to the St. Johns River. So hence why water is such a critical thing for me. And then I'm very happy to have a new working partner here because she represents something called the Social Capital Project, Kara Pike. And I thought it was so appropriate, again, divine order, because when I think of Pike, I automatically think of mountains for some reason. And so I thought it was so appropriate that Kara Pike would be one of our presenters here today. And Kara, you also represent whom? Besides the Social Capital Project.
Climate access.
Climate access. So is that not what we're trying to get them to do? Kind of access the climate a little bit?
And each other's talents and resources.
Exactly. And so I think that that is going to be an excellent thing to find out. Y'all interested like I am to know how Kara does, what she does? Yes? I think so. I don't know if Kara sings and all that like I do. We might get to do that later. But definitely, I want to now introduce to you Miss Kara Pike, our first presenter.
Well, it's great to be here with all of you, and I am part of the Resource Innovation Group in Oregon, where I direct the Social Capital Project. We are interested in understanding why people care about the environment but don't act. And most recently, we created climateaccess.org, which is a network of people working to engage the public in the transformational change that's needed to shift to low-carbon resilient communities. So I'm really fundamentally interested in what is the role of the public in the social change that is needed, and going far beyond just communicating, talking at people about what they should be stopping, and really understanding the people power potential and how to leverage that. But before I jump into the work I want to share with you today, I wanted to just share a little bit of my own story and why I do what I do. I grew up right along the Niagara River, and I was a little kid when Love Canal happened. And it really, from that age, stuck in my mind that the injustices that are occurring to the environment are occurring to ourselves. And why, when we have the knowledge that we have, do we ignore it and move in the other direction? And in particular, for those who aren't familiar with Love Canal, basically there was a housing development put on a toxic waste site that was never remediated. And the developers knew that that land was toxic. And it took a mom fighting for her kid's life and the kids in the neighborhood to actually break that open. So I've been really interested in the intersection of culture and the environment since that time. I'm a dual citizen. I'm a Canadian-American or American-Canadian, however you want to put it. And I live now on Vancouver Island. The work is based in Oregon, but I'm also living on an island. And part of why I moved there was I wanted to be in a community that felt like it had the potential to be resilient. And I wanted to have my kids grow up in a place that still had the potential of a future. Of course, you find out nowhere is immune to these challenges, and so we're dealing with a whole host of climate impacts, just like anywhere in the world. But I'm excited to be there because we were dedicated the first slow foods community in North America. There's very active effort in the part of the community to rebuild the local food systems. And it's actually, in many ways, more critical than looking at our energy systems, because the reason why we have the energy and development systems that we do is because of the food systems we put in place. And I also think from a community engagement standpoint, it is incredibly empowering to take the ability to grow your own food back into your hands and not feel like you have no choice and nowhere to go with your concern, which is, I think, really where a lot of people are at on climate change. The work that I do is analyzing a lot of the public opinion trends, what's coming out of social science, looking at what's happening in the field of community engagement, and it's pretty clear people care an awful lot about this. It's not a matter of why can't we get people to care. They don't know where to go with the care because it's painful, because we have an efficacy gap. We don't have a sense that there is a way forward. We don't have a sense, and a lot of the environmental narratives that we use don't talk about a future that's very viable. And I think that is wrong. I don't want my children to grow up thinking they have no future, because what is the point? So it may be a different future, but we have to be thinking about that and speaking from that place and speaking into that possibility of the excitement and the benefits and the possibilities that can come from addressing climate change. Some of the work that we've done with the Social Capital Project is around understanding social values and what underlies opinion. What are the worldviews that we hold that tie into our identities, that drive what our opinions are and the behaviors that we want to engage in? And from about 5 years of research on that, we determined there are 5 key barriers to environmental engagement, and they're very much true for climate as well. And the first is elitism. Coming to the environment and to the discussion from a place of self-righteousness, non-inclusion, not working to have the circle feel comfortable for everyone. It's tied in part to another barrier, which is environmental sainthood. Most people care, but think unless they're willing to move up into a tree and sacrifice all of their own personal self-interest, that they're not an environmentalist, that they're not good enough. And even the people who are working extremely hard to do all the individual changes Queen Quet mentioned, they feel like a gerbil running on a wheel. And for those who aren't as environmentally minded, it is something to repel. It's like someone who makes you uncomfortable, like a saint, can go one way or the other. The other is fatalism, which I mentioned, that if we don't believe we can solve these issues, people check out. And that's where we're at. And in particular with youth, which is really concerning because this is a very long-term issue. We need to think out into the long term, and we need to address that. Cognition. Most people don't think systemically, and we don't make it any easier for them. We think everyone gets that climate and weather are connected, that that's related to energy choices, consumption, and we don't take the time to actually respect that people need help making those jumps. And just like good framing, they need the dots connected to see that picture. Another key gap is around overload. People are getting so many messages about what they should and should not do. They're not organized, they're not prioritized, there are no feedback mechanisms, there are no rewards. So people say, what really matters? What should I be doing? And does it really matter that Aquafina has on its label, the plastic water bottle that I'm drinking from is now made from 65% post-consumer plastic. What really matters? And so people throw their hands up because they don't want to take a step that could inevitably do damage somewhere else. So I think these are really critical barriers that are with us in climate change conversations and public engagement. I want to quickly move to some of the work that we've been doing on understanding how to communicate impacts and the need to prepare for those impacts and reduce them. We've been arguing for some time that we need to get away from the scientific certainty, the science emphasis, into making the issue real and tangible, local for people, personal. And so that's really what we've been doing by looking at the existing polling, the existing literature that's out there to try and also from the practice, how do we really engage the public effectively in preparing and reducing climate risk? So just a few kind of trends from what we're seeing, and our work started back in 2007, so we've been looking at this for quite a few years now. And it's pretty clear that the adaptation conversation has come home. When we first started looking at what the trends were in 2007, adaptation was largely about other countries. Poor, vulnerable people in other countries, not Americans, not us, not your neighbor. It was a far away, far off issue. The other thing that we saw was that it was typically positioned as adaptation versus mitigation. And even in the public discourse, there were open arguments about whether or not adaptation made sense and would compete with mitigation. That has changed since 2007. There is growing recognition, and you're all aware of this, and that's why we're here, that mitigation alone is not enough. The challenge is that, well, adaptation is now on the table. It's still being seen as, well, am I going to invest in mitigation or should I do adaptation? And not enough integration between the two, which from a public opinion and engagement standpoint is critical, because that's when it gets real. When we get into the impacts happening in our communities, happening to our friends, happening to places that we love, and we move into action from there. There is a lot of potential. Other trends, there's growing research and evidence that the unfortunate situation of the increase of extreme weather events over the past year and a half in the U.S. is driving interest in climate. People are starting to make the connection. It's not always strong, but it's happening, and there's more we need to do. But I think there's a couple of really interesting things to think about in this area. And the first is that extreme weather events are operating in two very distinct ways in terms of shaping public opinion. The first is motivated reasoning. For the people on either ends of the pole, the people who already sort of care if you do Six Americas or track any of that, the alarmed see these big storm events, see the droughts, and say, aha, see, proof global warming is happening. So it's motivating their own reasoning of what they see. For those on the other end, we get a big cold snap, or we get a lot of snow at a weird time, and they say, see, there's no global warming. Why are we getting these freak snowstorms? That's not warming. You told me it would be getting hot. So for either sides of the spectrum, the storms are driving concern and conversation, but they're in very different ways. I think the opportunity lies in the middle, where what we're seeing is that people who aren't necessarily on one of those poles are starting to better understand climate through experiential learning. Now that's either through having the direct impacts occurring in their own community, or seeing it happening in other communities that they relate to. But I think the very important thing to keep in mind, and actually this is a benefit, because I really think it's problematic if we're always looking for leverage opportunities around human disaster. Not everyone needs to experience the extreme storm to get this. And in fact, for the people in the middle, the very subtle shifts in growing seasons is actually what they're thinking about. And I think there's a whole lot for us to play with and work with there around some of those more subtle things that aren't as scary, that you're not coming in and being insensitive to the human concerns in the wake of something like Sandy. We don't need to wait for those events to build this understanding. It's through the subtle changes as well. I also want to mention the importance of addressing uncertainty, and I know in a lot of the other sessions at the conference, uncertainty has largely been talked about in a technical, sort of scientific way. How do you do an adaptation plan when you have a certain amount of scientific uncertainty still in your models? When it comes to public engagement and what you can see from risk communication literature, regardless of facts, regardless of where the science is at, people have to process their own uncertainty. Their own uncertainty with how this issue is really going to matter, what it means for their lives. And even if all the facts are in, even if your projections, you feel very, very solid, you have to remember that people need to come through a process, and one of the most important things from risk communication is recognizing that someone is uncertain. And that is okay to be uncertain. I think we've had problems with this where we want to jump on skeptics all the time and they're wrong and we want to shut them down. But a lot of people are just trying to figure things out and deal with their own uncertainty. And it's very, very scary. We all know that from doing this work. You can really get into a dark place. So you have to actually respect and recognize that people are still uncertain, even if we don't feel that same degree of uncertainty. Some good news is that research and practice are starting to show that using a preparation frame does get traction with the public. You can often engage with people who don't want to talk about climate change by talking about the need to prepare for these shifts in our weather, these extremes in storms, the droughts, etc., and that it's just prudent and smart to be prepared for that. Just like Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, be prepared. Just like people look at the weather in the morning and say, I better take my umbrella because it's just smart to do that. I don't want to get stuck, just in case. And a lot of times we're so caught up in the certainty that we're not really willing to sort of go into prepare for things even if our projections are wrong. And insurance actually does this quite well, where the need for insurance is framed as not, there is a whatever percentage probability that your house will burn down. That's not why people buy insurance. They buy insurance because in the rare chance, in the very rare chance that you will have disaster in your own life, it could be so bad that you don't want to go there. You want to be prepared for that. And what we're seeing, particularly at a municipal level, that there's a lot of efforts going on across the country for cities to prepare for changes to the climate and to race to the top versus a negative, that you want to be the most prepared city because you will be taking care of your citizens, you'll be attracting business, you will be the place that people want to move to, just like I moved from California to the Pacific Northwest. We're making these choices now because of climate. So there's a huge opportunity around preparation, which involves prudence, can-do, all of those types of values. And I just want to focus on one last trend, which Queen Quetta's already mentioned, and others will today as well. But when moving into communicating about impacts, really keeping vulnerability and equity at the center is critical. To some people, resiliency sounds great, right? This is a wonderful, we want to be resilient. But to some communities, it sounds like an excuse for inaction, that we're just going to be dumped on more and be expected to be resilient in the light of these changes. So these terms mean different things for different people. It's very important to keep that in mind. It's very important, too, to keep in mind, obviously we all know there are disproportional impacts, and that climate change builds on existing inequities in our system. And so in talking about adaptation, preparation, which we call it instead, it's very important not to talk about getting back to some ideal state that we once were in, because for a lot of people, we are not already in an ideal state. We want to bounce forward to something better. We don't want to bounce back to where we were. We want to bounce forward to what we really want, equitable, safe, prosperous communities. So there's a number of recommendations we can talk about later, but I just want to close by talking about something that I feel is absolutely critical in public engagement on any issue, but in particular around adaptation and communicating impacts. And this was a very hard thing for me to learn. I'm trained as a communicator and an environmental scientist. I, for a decade, talked at people and told them what not to do. But developing our listening abilities, I think, is the most critical thing for public engagement. I know there's going to be more discussion of that as we go through. One tool I've found very, very helpful on this is the work of Otto Scharmer out of MIT and the Presencing Institute. And he talks about 4 levels of listening. And the top level, which is where we're typically at, is downloading. When you're listening to just confirm what you already know and believe the world to be. And once you hear it, you say, great, I got what I needed. Then you start to shut down. The second level is factual, where you're listening to identify your knowledge gaps. Oh, that's something new. I haven't heard about that before. How does that fit in with what I already understand the world to be? Empathetic is the next level, where you're actually listening to try and understand where people are coming from and what their needs are and their concerns and their fears, and actually consider those in not just your communication, but in your whole strategy. But the last level, and I think this is ultimately where we have to try and train ourselves to get to, is generative listening. When we're actually listening with an open heart, mind, and will to what's possible for the future, and we are listening into the future because climate is unprecedented. What we did to solve other problems in the past won't necessarily work. We've got to be willing to listen into what can become and figure out that bouncing forward that I talked about. So thank you for listening to what I've shared, and I look forward to our dialogue.
Excellent. Now, of course, I totally just did downloading, none of the other stuff. But definitely, I want you all to make sure that once we leave this circle, that you realize the dots of connection that was just mentioned by Carol are actually you. You are the dots. You are making up this circle. And so we want you to always still stay connected with us. You can always find me at queenquet.com, QUENQUET, queenquet.com, or you can go to Gullah Geechee Nayshun.com. I know y'all looking like, wow, that's a long one. Which is GULLAHGEECHEENATION.com. So GullahGeecheeNation.com or QueenQuet.com.